thank you all for being here. We're so excited for the 17th annual Newburyport Literary Festival, and this is also our third virtual festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson, and I'm on the steering committee. It is my pleasure to introduce Wil Haygood, who is the author of Tigerland, which was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Showdown, a finalist for the NAACP Image Award, In Black and White, and The Butler, which was made into a film by Lee Daniels. He has been a correspondent for the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, where he was a Pulitzer finalist. Haygood is a Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow and is currently a Bodway Visiting Distinguished Scholar at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Our moderator, Peter Guralnick, has been called a national resource by critic Nat Hedtoff. His books include the prize-winning 2-volume biography of Elvis Presley, Last Train to Memphis, and Careless Love. He won a Grammy for his liner notes for Sam Cooke Live at Harlem Square Club, as well as writing the scripts for the Grammy-winning documentary Sam Cooke Legend and Martin Scorsese's blues documentary Feel Like Going Home. His latest book, Looking to Get Lost, came out, I think, 2 years ago, and about it, Michael Eric Dyson wrote, Peter Guralnick is one of the 3 or 4 greatest writers in the country today. And we'll add Wil Haygood as one of the other 3 or 4 greatest writers in the country today. And I'm going to turn it over to you fellows. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Leslie. And I just want to start with my own very brief tribute to Wil, personal tribute, leading into a question. But, you know, Wil and I were last here 15 years ago in 2007, last year together. So it's good. I think it's good on both our parts to be back. Yeah. But it's really great to be back with this wonderful new book of Wil's. And one thing I'd like to get out of the way, Colorization has been described by Esquire and the New York Times and many other leading periodicals as a comprehensive and very elegant history of Black filmmaking. And it definitely is. But I want you to know it's much, much more than that. Like all of Wil's books, it's a masterclass in storytelling. It draws the reader in, tells the stories of people they may or may not be familiar with, and again, it reveals riveting details of their lives. And like all of Wil's books, it rests on the twin pillars of art and social justice. Wil, I mean, I can't tell you how much I learned, how much I enjoyed learning about things like the story of Sidney Poitier and Lorraine Hansberry and Raisin in the Sun, the connection between Harry Belafonte and Charlie Parker. I mean, who knew? Not me, definitely.
Yeah.
Zora Neale Hurston and Fannie Hurst, not to mention Lana Turner, or the fascinating, this is really fascinating, evolution of Porgy and Bess across all these different cultures, from Gullah to Gershwin, with Sammy Davis Jr.'s impromptu audition for Samuel Goldwyn, thrown in for good measure. The book is just so full of vivid anecdotes and telling details, from Birth of a Nation, the showing of it at Woodrow Wilson's racist White House, and Oscar Michaud's pioneering work, right through to Barry Jenkins and Moonlight. But I want to know, if you were to tell one story, I hope it's going to be the story I'm suggesting, but you can be any story you want. If you were to tell one story that exemplified so many of the struggles that are portrayed in the book, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about James Edwards, the world he came up in, and the opportunities that were missed. But really, any individual story is fine with me. That just was one that really struck me.
Yes, well, it's certainly, Peter, is very lovely to be sharing a virtual stage with you again. You're one of my literary heroes in the world, so it's lovely to be here under these circumstances. And many thanks for your reading of my work and your understanding of what I've tried to bring to the storytelling arc across these 9 books. I think that American history is so inextricably linked to film history that it needed to be written about. James Edwards was a fascinating figure. In a way, Peter, he was the Sidney Poitier before Sidney Poitier. He was born in the Midwest. He studied at a small college in Knoxville, Tennessee. He studied drama. A very handsome Black man. His parents saw lynchings when he was growing up, so he knew he wanted to get out of the Midwest. That's why he went to college. Even though he went to college in the South, you know, it was very dangerous there. But anyway, he made his way to New York and he started doing stage plays. And some movie people saw him and said, hey, you're very talented. You ought to come out here to California and try to get into the film business. So he did, and he had some very tiny roles. And then he was cast in a World War II movie called Home of the Brave in 1949. And it really was the first picture in a way where a Black man played a very serious role. He, you know, it wasn't a subservient role. It was a very muscular role. He was a military figure trapped on an island with other soldiers who were white. And the movie Home of the Brave is all about his fellow soldiers and how they must deal with his race and how his own race sort of haunts his mental stability. And he has a nervous breakdown. And that's what the movie is about. It got a lot of attention, and some people said, wow, this guy's going to be the first major Black film star. He's going to cross over. He's going to get into mainstream movies. But his phone didn't ring. It didn't happen. The studios and the screenwriters just couldn't come up with work for him. And of course, it was because he was Black, and his career sort of began a slow fade. Even though he still appeared in movies, he never achieved the notoriety that he had achieved in that 1949 movie, Home of the Brave. James Edwards. It's a name that many people don't know, and I think they should know.
Well, you know, that could be a movie in itself. I mean, the story of his unfulfilled, it wasn't unfulfilled promise, it was his unfulfilled ambition, in a sense, his
yes.
unfulfilled career. And, you know, there's so much more about this in the book. And I mean, like, the book is just rich in so much in so much detail. And that was one of the things. I mean, Dorothy Dandridge, I think, enters into the story, as I recall.
Yes.
So
yeah, there was something else also that frightened many of the Hollywood studio bosses, and it was when they heard that any white actress happened to be dating someone who was Black. And so James Edwards had several affairs with white actresses, and the studios did not like that. I mean, this nation has always been haunted by race up to the present day, and the film community played right along with that. They hindered any movement that might have happened going forward. And so if you have the movie studios sidetracked with stereotype, then they were looking for scripts that had stereotypical figures in them, which is why so many Black women were reduced to playing maids for so long. And I write about that. It's one of the reasons why James Edwards, his career never flourished. His last appearance, by the way, was in 1970s Patton about George Patton, played by George C. Scott. And James Edwards was the military valet in that movie. that came out in 1970. He never got a chance to see it because he died before the movie came out. He was working on the script in a little lonely apartment in San Diego, all by himself. And so a tragic ending.
Well, it's an amazing story, just like the Hattie McDaniel is an amazing story if you go to the maid stereotype. But with James Edwards, you feel like here was the prototype, or somebody who could have been Sidney Poitier, could have been Jim Brown in a sense, could have been an action hero, but
yes,
it never happened. And one thing that has struck me so much, and in reading your books, is that there are so many connections between all of the books. In many ways, the characters who show up in one book are likely to show up in another, whether it's about Thurgood Marshall or Sammy Davis Jr. or your own family. But the similarities, I think, there are similarities both in style and in substance. But the book that Colorization, which is why we're here today, seems closest to me, is Sweet Thunder, your biography of Sugar Ray Robinson, the man who taught Muhammad Ali about style long before there was a Muhammad Ali.
Right.
Now, ostensibly, Sweet Thunder is a biography, and it's certainly very much about boxing. And you've got a lot of great stuff in there, and you've had a lot of great boxing experts, I think, to bring you along. But it's so much more than that. Sweet Thunder is so much more than that. It seems to me the world of Sugar Ray Robinson suggests very much the illimitable dimensions of a community that's so rich in its diversity and cultural breadth, in which colorization also takes place. And so many of the characters are interchangeable too. So even though Sugar Ray is not a movie star, although he may soon be, we hope he will.
Yeah.
Then I wonder if you could talk a little about some of the parallels and about the world that he and so many of the people you're writing about in Colorization inhabited, the world that gives the backdrop for the stories you're telling.
Yes. And that is, I'm so happy that you said that, Peter, and felt that, because it is a sepia world that I have dived into, sepia world of the 20th century. And I think that idea set inside of my brain in the late 1970s. I came across a book, and it was a book called The Letters of Langston Hughes and Arna Bontemps, 1925 to 1967. It's like a 500-page book. And I started reading this book, and they were just letters. Two Black men writing letters across 4 decades about jazz, music, nightclubs, entertainment, acting, poetry, their short stories. It was a world that I wasn't introduced to in high school or college. It was like this big party that most of the country didn't know about. And they had captured it in a net. And I said, this is amazing that Langston Hughes knew James Baldwin, who knew Charlie Parker, who had met all the giants in Paris, who knew Dexter Gordon, who knew Sugar Ray Robinson, who knew Lena Horne, who was at Sugar Ray Robinson's nightclub. So was Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, it was a small world if you were Black, but it exploded upon the scene of 1930s America, 1940s America, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And it was just rich to me if I could keep diving and diving and diving into that world, because not enough has been written about that world. And I just took it upon my shoulders to write about it. And so, yes, my book about Sugar Ray Robinson is also about his friendship with 3 crucial people: Miles Davis, Lena Horne, and Langston Hughes. And I said to myself, if you tell that story that way, then you bring more than just a sports drama, a sports narrative into the story. This man, Sugar Ray Robinson, won championship titles 6 times. He was an astounding figure, but he was also very jazzy and very stylish. So I thought if I was to reach out from Thurgood Marshall, from Sugar Ray Robinson, from Sammy Davis Jr., if I was to reach out from these figures, that I could also write of this larger world that included drama and music and culture and fashion shows and style. And it just became fun. It just became a joy to travel around the world and the country and go into archives and interview people. I mean, I tracked down Sammy Davis Jr.'s mother. She was in her 90s. And so to track down these people and to hear these live voices was just fascinating to me.
Well, you know, the incredible thing is, I mean, it's like in Colorization and Sugar Ray Robinson, it makes the world so much more colorful, so much more vivid. I mean, there's Duke Ellington, there's Lena Horne. Lena Horne shows up quite a bit in I forget whether you, and there's a hell of a lot of glamour in both stories, and that's something that should attract any reader. Anybody should enjoy it. But the thing is, as you say, it's profound too. It's profound in the way that, you know, James Baldwin wrote about in The Fire Next Time, about the culture that had been forced back on itself to create its own world, and in the process created a world that was adopted by the white world, by the majoritarian world. It's what Laura Neale Hurston celebrated. It's just, you know, why should we go apologizing for what we have and seek out what's out there? We've got everything right here. And it's not that you're not like somebody who writes these, but you don't write, I'm trying to think, screeds, or, you know, you don't write these. But it's there, and that's what I think makes the story so exciting. It has all these other dimensions, and the Sugar Ray, man, it just comes alive, as does Colorization, and all these, you know, you go chapter to chapter, you go story to story, and your world is broadening all the time.
Yeah. And I really think it's very significant to, you know, to open up the stories, you know, to go as wide as I possibly can. Before I started doing this book, I didn't know that James Baldwin, who appears in my other books, also wrote an early draft of a Malcolm X script. I did not know that. I mean, that's just fascinating. I did not know how instrumental Ralph Nelson and Stanley Kramer, 2 brave white men in the 50s, who helped Sidney Poitier's career. I did not know that it was Sammy Davis Jr. who had been sending Martin Luther King Jr. money to bail civil rights marchers, SCLC workers out of jail. And so many of these stories as well, Peter, do not show up in histories written by white writers. It's just sad. You look at the books that came out in the 50s and the 60s and some of the 70s, and you know, they ignore wide swaths of Black history. You're one of the few writers who I know intimately who dives wholeheartedly into that world, but that world is not written about enough. And African American is American history, and so we have to acknowledge that and honor that. And I think it's very important. When I started my Sammy Davis Jr. book, there was no major Sammy Davis Jr. biography. Why? Right. When I started my Sugar Ray Robinson book, there was no major Sugar Ray Robinson book. Why? Adam Clayton Powell, there was no major Adam Clayton Powell book. One came out like almost at the same time, but still, his life was so epic, it should have been studied and written about way before Wil Haygood showed up on the scene. I'm happy it wasn't, but still, that's just a fact. It should have been.
Well, yeah, and the people that you reveal, let's say Sammy Davis Jr., everybody might think, and I want to get to something else in a second, but everybody might think, oh, I know Sammy Davis Jr. He was sort of the junior member of the Rat Pack. He was kind of a mascot for the Rat. You know, Lucky was included there with Frank and Dean. The story that Sammy Davis Jr. you portray is so totally different. And the story is so completely different. So I don't think the story is going to get told right away in the Florida schools. But hopefully,
you're right. Yeah.
But hopefully it's going to, you know, I mean, I feel like, you know, and again, you know, it's not like you're writing these lesson plans or anything. You're writing living stories and they come alive. And that's why, I mean, anybody who reads Colorization is going to get so much out of it. Even if they think they know a lot, they're still going to get so much because it's just a whole different story. Now, I have one other, before we get Leslie back in here with us, I had one other sort of broad question I wanted to ask you. And one thing that's always struck me about your writing, and forgive me for, I wrote these things down because I wanted to say them as well as I could. The one thing that's struck me about your writing is that there's no holdback in any of it. Whether it's the biographies or the extended profiles you wrote for so many years about figures as different as Marion Barry or James Baldwin or Eugene Allen, the White House butler. In every one, I sense your total commitment to the subject, to whatever discipline, digging, you mentioned the digging, above all, emotional commitment you need to bring the story alive. Whether it's someone famous or, as in your memoir, the Haygoods of Columbus, your own family.
Yeah.
Is that part of the bargain you make, this full-on commitment, 99.5% won't do? Is that part of the bargain you make, not just with your reader, but with yourself? And you don't have to limit yourself to the books I've mentioned, but that's the overarching thing that I get from your writing. Yes,
I really think, Peter, that I spent many years on newspapers. And and then I transitioned to books. And so I remember my first book editor, Peter Davison. I was working on the Adam Clayton Powell book, and I handed in the first 50 pages of it. It was my first big book, you might say. And he read it, and then he called me to his office, and he said, "Hey, it's all fine, and it's all there, but you have to get into the skull, the skull, the skull of this story. And so that means that you're going to have to go outside of the ordinary zone of newspaper writing." He said, because somebody who's going to buy a 350, 400-page book by Wil Haygood ultimately wants to know what Wil Haygood thinks of this narrative. And so I think that gave me a kind of a narrative fearlessness to go into the stories of these books. I think I had to be braver. I think I had to do such interviewing and research that I think I had to convince myself that, okay, I'm the authority here. Okay, I don't have to play second string with Sugar Ray Robinson, because I have tracked down the prize fighters who he stepped into the ring with. I have tracked down women who he dated. I have tracked down jazz people who were in the band with him. I have gone to Europe. And so once I was able to fill all of my body and soul up with that, I think it gave me a certain wherewithal and a certain type of muscle to write the kind of books that I want to write.
Well, and I think it goes even beyond, what you said, because in a sense, it's not a question of being an authority in the sense that you can recite facts or, that you can, it's in a sense, it's going inside the story. It's not just the skull, it's the heart, it's getting to the, it's the gut. And it's just being able to tell the story with confidence. I'm just speaking about what I feel you do. And I feel like you carried that over into your subsequent newspaper work too, so that many of the profiles you wrote there too, but it's just basically being able to write with confidence. I mean, I don't know about before. I don't know before the Adam Clayton Powell. But to be able to write with confidence almost from the inside out. And it seems to me that's something, and it requires more exposure. It's like you say, bravery. It seems to me it requires exposing more of yourself than a reporter is necessarily accustomed to do.
Yeah. I mean, I would look around the country and look at writers who I admire, like Richard Rose, and David Levering Lewis, and Peter Guralnick. And I could see how deep they went to tell the soul of a story. And that really gave me confidence. I mean, just the way that you wrote about Elvis or Sam Cooke, or Sam Phillips. I mean, these are deep, deep, deep dives. And you don't come away from those books without feeling that you've spent years with that person's torments, triumphs, and dreams. And that's when you can say, all right, this is art. This is art. If you can make Elvis Presley, who everybody thought they knew, if you can have the critics write that, stop the presses. We've never read anything like this before. I mean, if one can do that with a book, with major cultural figures who are already in the news, if you can change the dynamic and make people go, whoa, then that's something that's special.
Well, that's what I think happens with so many of the figures in colorization and so many of the other things. But when you mention a well-known figure, you have somebody like Adam Clayton Powell. I'm going to call him Leslie in a second. But you have someone like Adam Clayton Powell. And the world, certainly thought they knew him. And there he is out front saying, keep the faith, baby. And everybody's, on that. But he was, again, so much more, and he was at the center of so much that was going on in such a world. And he came from such a background, and all of that is subsumed into your biography in a way that, you're not hitting the reader over the head with it, but you're bringing the reader to an entirely new understanding.
That, Peter, is a great point. Thanks for saying that, because there was an effort to marginalize Sammy Davis Jr. and just reduce him to Frank Sinatra's shadow, me and my shadow in the Rat Pack. But I mean, if you marginalize Sammy Davis Jr., then you don't write about his mother, his heritage, the fact that he was left behind when he was a kid, that he never went to school, that he had this honorary uncle, Will Maston, who was born into vaudeville and stayed in vaudeville for many, 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 many years. And he discovered Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, if you just reduce Sammy and marginalize him to the Rat Pack, then you never get the richness of the large story that he was a part of and that he helped make.
The larger story of the world, the community, and his own brilliance and genius, his individual
Right.
genius, which is just, well, let me call on Leslie to bring up some of the questions. I know there's lots of people who have questions, and Leslie can voice them.
Well,
Okay.
this has so far been so interesting, Peter. You have some amazing questions, but we also have some questions from our audience members, including Festival Director Vicki Hendrickson. She asks, Wil, so she read about how you came to write this book, but she'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you approached the subject and what you thought it would be like versus what it turned out to be.
Okay. First, hi, Vicki. Sending my love to you. Thank you for having me here this year. I grew up in the 60s in Columbus, Ohio, and there was a little neighborhood theater. And when I was 10 years old, 5th grade, my mother started allowing me to go outside of the home alone. So I would walk to the theater on Sunday. It was about a mile walk. So I would walk to the theater on Sundays. Me and my sister, but it was my first solo trips out of my home. And I would go see movies every Sunday after church. I would go to the Garden Theater on North High Street. And I saw movies that starred Lee Marvin, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin, John Wayne, Charles Bronson, Elizabeth Taylor. All of these people had one thing in common. They were all white. When I was a kid in the 5th, 6th, 7th grade at the Garden Theater, and me and my sisters happened to be talking about this recently, there never was a Black figure on the big screen. Then I went away to college in the 70s and I came home and there was another theater that had opened downtown. It was called the Southern Theater. And it was right at the height of the so-called Blaxploitation movement. And so then there were actors who looked like me. There was Ossie Davis and Jim Brown and Sidney Poitier. There was Eartha Kitt. I mean, there was just a cavalcade of blackness on the big screen. Sweetback's Badass Song. There was Foxy Brown with Pam Grier. I mean, there was Richard Pryor. There was Ron O'Neal and Superfly. It was a whole new world. So that showed me that there were really two kinds of cinemas in this country. One cinema didn't have enough money, didn't have enough opportunity, and they didn't have enough movies that were made. And that happened to be Black cinema. White cinema had all kind of stuff, musicals and drama and sports narratives. And so when I had gotten the idea for this book, I said to myself, okay, you have to not only write about those two kind of cinemas, but you have to write about Black films in a white world. And that backdrop really pushed the narrative into a whole nother sphere to me. It really made the narrative more honest, more blunt, more truthful. One of the things that I'm so heartened by is that I've heard from actors in Hollywood, and more than a few have told me, I hope this book will changes Hollywood for the better, because we still go into meetings and we sit down, and these are Black actors, and we sit down facing 9 or 10 people, and they're all white. I mean, there is no inclusion in so many of these studios, no varied voices. And yes, there are wonderful white heroes in this book, people who went out on limbs to help Black actors, filmmakers, who to help Spike Lee, but it's not enough. It's like that line from Hamilton. We want to be in the room, and that is crucial. So I think that drove me to write this book. You know, how do people keep fighting to get in the room? And all these stories behind the fight are fascinating. It's a drama inside of a drama, and then another drama inside of that drama.
Amazing. And Vicki would also just like to remind you, I think she's mentioned before, there's no biography of Leontyne Price, the great opera singer. She would really like to see this in the future. Just
Okay.
FYI.
Duly noted.
Carol has a question. She'd like to hear your thoughts on Birth of a Nation, both from a sociological point of view, but also from a film history point of view.
Yes, a very tough movie to watch, a very racist movie, a vulgar movie, came out in 1915. It was a movie about the Ku Klux Klan in the aftermath of the Civil War. You know, cinema was still kind of new, and the film was such a big spectacle. It was the Jaws and Star Wars and Star Trek and Mission Impossible of its time. 1 out of 4 people in the country went to see that movie, and it played across 4 years, and it caused riots, uprisings, civil rights protests, marches, court cases to try to stop the movie from being shown in certain towns. But it's a part of our film history. So I've been asked, should the movie be shown? Well, yes, but it has to be shown in context. I mean, we have to really have a lecture before the movie is shown. It's hard to show the whole movie because it's like about 4 hours. It's a long movie, but it's full of hate. It's a movie that is full of hate. It just is. But it also, you know, it was the first blockbuster in Hollywood, and it was a cruel, lash to the Black populace in this country. And when you look at that, and then you see how far Black cinema has come, I mean, it's a very triumphant story in many ways. It's a story that's still being written, but that was a deep hole that Blacks had to climb out of, because cinema became a weapon. It was weaponized. It hurt Black people. Mothers, mothers were afraid of that movie. Lynchings in the country went up during the showing of that movie. And it took years and years and years for cinema to get better, for cinema to do its own reckoning, its own racial reckoning. And we saw that with the 2015 in the Oscars So White, when there were no Blacks who were nominated for Oscars. And people wondered if that was a fluke. And then it happened again in 2016. Again, there were no Blacks who were nominated, and it was shameful. And so then we saw Charlottesville and the KKK marches, and we saw the death of George Floyd, and so there has to be a racial reckoning in this country when it comes to race. And I think if you study film, that's just part of the story, but it's a big part of the story because of how the film business was created, how it flourished, and how it made money.
Interesting. So Cynthia writes in that she's part of Newburyport's Black History Initiative that is working on putting up information about little known but vibrant but vibrant Black people in the community. And so she's wondering if you have any guidance about unearthing details about people who made an impact but were not famous. And I would add, maybe even had their stories suppressed, that they weren't included in history books. What would your advice be?
My goodness. I mean, I think we have to dig deeper to find these stories. I mean, like we had started talking about this unknown actor, James Edwards, and he's not mentioned in many books, and yet he's someone who I think it would be valuable to know about. And so, it's the study of history. We run from history in this country. We're trying to ban books now. I mean, it's a frightful thing that's happening. It's as if history scares us, and it should not. It makes us stronger if we know history, and if it makes somebody feel sad, well, the truth is the truth. I mean, you don't want to have an ankle that is broke and have your doctor not tell you the truth about that ankle. You want the doctor to say, hey, the ankle's broke and you need a cast, and you need the cast for 6 weeks. You don't want the doctor to say, oh, it's going to be okay. The swelling's going to go down and you will be able to run in 4 weeks. No, you won't. No, you won't. You'll be suffering from that ankle because it's still broke. No matter how good some mornings you might feel, there's a bone still deep inside that ankle that's broke and it hasn't healed properly. And even if you can run on it or walk on it, it's going to splinter again. And so it's important to get honest reaction and to act honorably when you come up against the truth.
One thing I just like to throw in is that there's a book, and I'm not gonna get the title right, called Black Concord or Black Walden, about the African-American population in Concord in the 19th century. And it's an amazing book in terms of the research that went into it and the digging that went into it and the description of Black people's lives, both slaves in Massachusetts, pre-Civil War, and freedmen and women, and the extent to which that's suppressed. But the only way to find that, and I'm sure the same would hold true in Newburyport or Portsmouth or anywhere, is just digging into the archives, because the archives do exist. There are things you can find. I don't have expertise. I'm not suggesting that, but there's no, it's just like with your doctor. There isn't any shortcut. You have to just dig into it, but it's there. It's there to be found. And that book, if I'm sorry, I can't give you the name, the right name and the right author, but you can find it. And it's an amazing documentation of something that who would ever have thought, well, you would have thought, but whoever knew until this book came out. Yeah.
Whoever knew. I mean, yeah. There was somebody who wrote me a letter who said, I have a master's degree in film, and this person, I think they were in their late 30s, but they told me that in college, they never studied Oscar Micheaux. He is the godfather of Black cinema in this country. And I write a whole chapter about him. He started making movies in the 1930s. He was a Black man in South Dakota. And then he started making more and more movies. He went to New York. He went to the Carolinas. Had nothing to do with Los Angeles, Hollywood. They did not want anything to do with him. But he made movies. And this was when my book came out late last year. And this person had told me that I never knew about Oscar Micheaux, Will, until I read your book. And I have a master's degree in film studies. That, to me, is appalling. It is just appalling. So, I hope that my book helps school people, helps them learn. There have been books written about Oscar Micheaux, but for some reason those books didn't end up in this person's hands. And I think if you write about Oscar Micheaux against the backdrop of the whole world, then I think his story becomes quite fascinating. In the arc and the fact, and that Sidney Poitier in the 1970s was telling people, hey, you got to study Oscar Micheaux, and even Sidney Poitier knew that.
And this is to some extent the counter story to Birth of a Nation, isn't it? I mean, his dedication and his devotion to tell the story.
Yes. He wanted to undo all of the damage that had been done by that earlier racist movie.
Well, I'm so sorry to say that we're out of time, but this has been fascinating. Thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And we're happy to have facilitated this reunion after 15 years. Again, thank you so much, Wil. Thank you so much, Peter. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks. Thanks, Vic. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter, my man. Thank you. Bye-bye.
It's great.